Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, and today we are going to do the program on Roberto Calvi and his murder. There's going to be a lot of connecting the dots here, so it's going to be very interesting. And we welcome Brother Alexis to the show.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV. This is kind of like the crowning piece of all our investigation on CIA corruption in the Vatican in the 20th century. And we're going to just run into a lot of familiar things here. Where does the story begin? I guess we have to start with John Paul I. He was assassinated. It's pretty clear he was assassinated. He went to clean up the Vatican bank that was washing money for the mob and the CIA as part of Gladio. And he lived 30 days and then, well, seems like someone poisoned him.
Yep.
Then who gets elected?
Pope John Paul II.
John Paul II. I remember John Paul II was famous. You hear it said even to this day in Rome. He took pride in the fact that he never once stepped inside the Vatican bank's building at the Vatican during his entire pontificate. He gave them free reign. That doesn't really sound like someone who should be investigating what happened to his predecessor. That sounds like someone who might have been elected by the perpetrators of the murder. So John Paul II, he brings someone into the Vatican, makes him president of the Vatican city-state, an American. Who was that?
Yeah. So it was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus.
And who is this Marcinkus? Where does he come from? What's his history?
Marcinkus was born in Cicero, Illinois, son of an immigrant window cleaner who arrived in Cicero in 1914. His father, Michaelis, had left Lithuania to escape possible induction into the Russian army. Moving to the United States, he briefly lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, before moving to Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, to work for a cousin as a farmhand, then moving to Cicero after finding work in Chicago steel mill. By the time his fourth son, Paulos, arrived, he had started cleaning windows for the Leo Sheridan Company, a job he would hold for 30 years.
So his father's a window cleaner, very humble, and he gets a priestly vocation, goes on to study. Where does he become a priest?
Okay, so Archbishop Marcinkus goes to Archbishop Quigley Preparatory Seminary. Then he goes to St. Mary of the Lake Seminary. Paul was ordained to the priesthood for the Archdiocese of Chicago on May 3rd, 1947.
Now, the first thing I want to remark, because this is a big characteristic of the problems of the 20th century church, if you studied for the priesthood, you didn't get drafted in the Second World War. So this guy is what I call a draft dodger vocation. He decided instead of going to fight, he was going to study for the priesthood. That's not always a sign of a lack of virtue, but his father was a draft dodger too. Doesn't look that good. It's not like coming from a family of military men. So he becomes a priest, and then, wow, he goes on to study canon law.
Yep. So beginning in 1950, Marcinkus began to fulfill special assignments for the Vatican and became friendly with Cardinal Giovanni Battista Montini, later Pope Paul VI, while studying canon law at the Gregorian University.
Now, the Gregorian University is a Jesuit school. It's really highly connected, but it's kind of strange how this guy goes from absolute poverty in the United States to being an associate of Montini. Montini was the guy who was in the room when Pius XII is making the deal with Wild Bill Donovan to take money from the CIA in 45. So Montini was definitely a CIA, at least friend, if not co-agent there in the Vatican from the earliest part of his career. So if Marcinkus gets involved in that, Marcinkus has probably been recruited into the CIA, or at least is wanted by the CIA in the Vatican. He's an American. They know him. They can speak his language. And well, he gets his doctorate like in what, 52, 53 in canon law, and then his career just takes off, doesn't it?
Yeah, then he completed the 2-year program for prospective diplomats at the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy and was assigned to Bolivia in 1955 and to Canada 4 years later, serving as secretary and nunciator of the Holy See in both instances.
So if any CIA ops are being run, he would be the contact guy there. And he served until what year in after Canada? What did he do after Canada? Does it say?
Beginning in December 1959, he worked as the Secretary of State in Rome and served on occasion as interpreter for Pope John XXIII. Under Paul VI, Marcinkus became the prime English translator and helped manage arrangements for papal overseas trips. In addition, his height and muscular build enabled him to serve as bodyguard for Paul VI, earning him the nickname the Gorilla.
And actually, in 1970, when Paul VI was on a papal visit to the Philippines, someone tries to stab him to death, and Marcinkus saves the Pope's life. But it's a known fact here in Italy, it's well documented that Montini was a homosexual. So maybe this is how they hit it off there back in the 50s. And as soon as he comes to power in Rome, he brings his good friend back to Rome. Forgive me for smiling, but what else can you do in the face of this kind of corruption? It's so absolutely base. And so private secretary, Paul VI, and he's such a private secretary, he ends up getting consecrated a bishop, right?
Yeah, he gets made titular Archbishop of Horta, and 2 months later, he refused to allow Secret Service agents to be present during a private audience between Paul and U.S. President Richard Nixon, saying, "I'll give you 60 seconds to get out of here, or you'll explain to the president why the Pope cannot see him today."
So why would the Pope and the president need such a private meeting that the Secret Service couldn't be trusted? It's a diplomatic offense not to trust the bodyguards of a head of state. However, if you're a CIA agent, you definitely wouldn't trust the Secret Service, who is like a thief for leaks of information. So this means the CIA is so controlling what's going on privately between Paul VI and Richard Nixon, who's skull and bones lodge candidate for the presidency, always won, even when he was proposed to run against Kennedy. And that shows you clearly that Marcinkus knows he has power over the Secret Service, and you wouldn't know that you had that power unless you were a CIA operative, agent, or already prepared.
Yeah.
And interesting. So he stays in the Vatican, and John Paul II. Now, here's someone who's been involved in all the dirt and corruption of the Paul VI administration, which led to all the corruption in the Vatican, and perhaps even the assassination of John Paul I. But John Paul II doesn't demote this guy; he promotes him.
Yeah. So after 3 years after Pope John Paul II's election, on September 26, 1981, Marcinkus was appointed the president of Vatican City State.
Now, 1981 September, this is going to start a year of interest, because in May 13th, 1982, John Paul II is shot in Vatican Square. And here's where the story really gets turbid. So there's this bank in Milan. It's called the Banco Ambrosiano. It was founded in the previous century, and it was partly owned by the Vatican. Okay. And one of the many of these investments that no doubt Bernardino Nogara made under Pius XII. And we talked about Bernardino Nogara being a Freemason, and the one that got the Vatican all involved in all the Masonic banks, because the Pius XI, Pius XII, Benedict XV were clearly at least acting as Freemasons if they weren't Freemasons themselves. So this Banco Ambrosiano had financial difficulties. They wanted to raise capital. They got permission to go public on the Italian stock market, which was at Milan. It's called the Borsa. and their shares sold on the first day on May 5th, 1982. Except it didn't really go the way they thought. Their shares fell 20% in value in one day, wiping out the assets of lots of investors. People were mad. And this is a bank that is a front for the Vatican Bank. So that's May 5th. 8 days later, someone tries to assassinate John Paul II in Vatican Square. Is that a coincidence? I don't think the Italian police thought it's coincidence, because 7 days after John Paul II was shot, who do they arrest?
Roberto Calvi for illegal transfer of funds out of the country and locked up in Lodi prison.
And Lodi prison's in north of Milan. Roberto Calvi, what was his position in the Banco Ambrosiano? Was he the manager?
He was, I believe he was the manager.
So he's locked up. Italy had strict laws about, and it still does, even if you deposit your own money into your own bank account, you have to say where the money came from. You just can't, make it up. And it's even more strict then. So after the Pope gets shot, I'm sure the entire Italian state apparatus starts saying, we better investigate what's going on. And someone in the Italian Treasury Department, it's called Guardia di Finanza, decided, well, we know about Calvi's moving money out, let's arrest him on this. And they probably didn't realize what they were touching. Because Calvi, the Banco Ambrosiano wasn't just a Vatican front. It was, as we're going to see, what it really is. So Calvi gets nervous. He's held in jail, and he writes a letter asking for help.
Yeah, he writes a letter to. I believe it was John Paul II asking for help.
He writes a letter to John Paul II, who has just been shot and is recovering in the hospital. And John Paul II, years later, John Paul II's secretary says, the Holy Father never got that letter and never read that letter. You're going to see why they have to deny it, because, well, now Calvi's talking. He knows the dirt on everyone. If he's asking for help, he's a security risk.
Yeah. So he then gets out with an appeal by his lawyer, and also the lawyer pays the bail. And he returns to his position as Ambrosian's chairman. So he was the head honcho chair guy. Then by August 1st, he had to go to Archbishop Marcinkus and ask for a letter of patronage.
And basically, he wants evidence. His lawyer says, get evidence to show that you are acting as an agent of the Vatican for moving all this money around, which the Vatican is doing as part of its corrupt collaboration with the CIA and the mafia and the drug money and all that. And he thinks Marcinkus is his friend.
Yeah. And so the letter dated September 1st, 1981, was written on Vatican letterhead. It reads as follows. Gentlemen, this is to confirm that we directly or indirectly control the following entries. Manic S.A. Luxembourg, Astrofine S.A. Panama, Nord Europe Establishment Liechtenstein, United Trading Corporation Panama, Aaron S.A. Panama, Bellatrix S.A. Panama, Beltros S.A. Panama, Starfield S.A. Panama. We also confirm our awareness of their indebtedness towards yourselves as of June 10, 1981, as per the attached statement of the accounts.
What's the Vatican doing with all these shell companies in Panama? Center for Drug Running and Center for CIA. These are the companies to which the CIA washed money into the Vatican Bank to take down the Polish government. We'll get to that. Yeah. So John Paul II is shot. Calvi is accidentally grabbed. Yeah. He starts talking. He wants people to help him. He finds out he doesn't really have that much help.
Yeah.
What goes down next?
Well, while the everything was while the letter was doing its job to get everything back into normal, like they think it's supposed to do, and how it say try to save the Vatican Bank, and it also quieted the concerns of the Ambrosian shareholders. And while and at this time, Marquinhos was making his pronouncement of trust in Robert. Calvi, Roberto Rosioni, the general manager of Ambrosio, was making a new demand for Calvi's dismissal as director and for a call on the loans that had been made to the Vatican. And so Rosioni was making agitations, and the head honcho owner guy who runs it is a former doctor, Pazienza, responds to demands of the troublesome chatterbox, as he calls Rosioni, by contacting Flavio Carboni, who was connected to Banda della Maddalena.
The
Carboni is
band, yeah, go.
so Carboni issued the contract. On April 27th, Rosioni was shot by an assailant with a pistol as he left his apartment for work. Several Milanese police officers heard the shots and killed the gunman. The hit had been entirely botched. Rosioni managed to survive the attack, and the gunman turned out to be no ordinary Magdalena street thug, but Danilo Abbracciati, the leader of the notorious gang.
Yeah, see now the Banda della Magliana is a Gladio organization here in Rome that was involved in some lot of brutal murders. It's alleged they might still exist, and whenever the CIA wants someone assassinated, they're the group to do it. And all the people they shoot and kill, they use ammunition of a very rare type. And after years of investigation, it found that the ammunition was stored in the basement of the Italian state police. So the Banda Maglione is obviously an Italian state entity working for the CIA as a cover. They pretend to be a criminal organization, but actually a dirty art group. So the Banco Ambrosiano goes up. Its shares fall even more in value. They have debts of $1.5 billion, and someone works out a plan to sell the Vatican part of the bank off. The Vatican agrees to pay $232 million for their part of the loss, but they're going to sell some shell companies that the Bank Ambrosiano owns, so that the Bank Ambrosiano can pay off its debt. And who ends up buying those?
So the guy who puts this plan into the works and gets it done is Francisco Pazienza, the former physician. In March 1981, Pazienza began to devise a plan to plug the gaping $1.7 billion hole within the Banco Ambrosiano that had been created by, I believe it was 9 shell companies.
Yeah, the 9 shell companies are siphoning money out for Vatican or CIA ops or drug money ops.
So through his CIA contacts, he arranged for 2 American investors, David Rockefeller,
head of the Bilderbergers.
Yeah.
Citibank, New York, Masonic Bank, would buy Vatican property to keep the Vatican Bank from going bankrupt under John Paul II. Does that even sound credible? Does not sound credible, but it did in fact happen. Yeah. And also some Saudi investors. Yeah. So why does Rockefeller feel so chummy to the Catholic Church that he's saving the Banca Ambrosiano? Mm-hmm. And he's only buying 16% share. Yeah. In a bank that is so stained with bad reputation. Now, okay, so they solve the financial problem. Now you just have to get rid of the guy who knows all the dirt, and that's John Calvi. And everyone needed to get rid of this guy. The new owners of the bank, the old owners of the bank, and the Vatican. And there's only two people in the Vatican that knew what was going on, and that's John Paul II and Marcinkus.
Hmm.
So someone ordered the hit.
Yeah.
Now, when they first go after Calvi's secretary.
Yeah. The day after he vanishes with all the papers in his briefcase, all the papers with names, dates, amounts, everything. The day after he vanishes and flees Milan for England, Graziella Corocce, the banker's 55-year-old personal secretary, was hurled from the fifth floor of the Ambrosiano. The body
So his
landed
secretary.
with a thump on the ramp leading to the bank's underground garage. No arrests were made, and the cause of her death remains undetermined.
So his private secretary is thrown out of the window from the fifth story, murdered to silence her. They find a suicide note. They claim it's suicide. Here's a bank run by the Vatican, and someone is thrown out of the fifth floor, and there's no investigation. How is that even possible? Okay, and we've already explained possible because Gladio and the Vatican have worked together since 1945. The Italian Republic that is instituted after World War II is really just a front for the US government. Almost everyone is bought off by the CIA. And this is what, when things don't need to be investigated, they don't get investigated. So she dies a tragic death, a terrible, you can find, if you look up Graziella Corocce on, you can find her photos on the internet, terrible what they did to this woman.
Yeah.
Calvi, though, Calvi really didn't understand how corrupt everything was. He knew all the clergy he knew were corrupt. He wrote a letter to his daughter about that, but he doesn't find anyone in the church who's helping him, and he knows the police are after him. So he turns to the mafia, thinking they'll help him, a Sardinian mafiosa, and he flees to Terest. They smuggle him over the border to Croatia, out of Yugoslavia. Then they drive him to Innsbruck and fly him on a private plane, and he thinks he's going to dump all this information off to a British paper and expose everyone. He even writes his own daughter, didn't he?
Yeah. He's like, the priest will be the end of us. They believe in any case that if someone dies, their soul lives on. So it's not such a bad thing. That's to his daughter Anna, April 19th.
And tells her to get out of Zurich and flee to the United States. His wife's already fled to Washington, D.C. And he says something, his last call is something big's going to break tomorrow. Evidently, he thought he was going to go to the newspaper and dump all these documents. That's the mafia told him. The mafia had other plans for him.
Yep.
So how does he die?
So on June 17th, the body of Roberto Calvi was found hanging from an orange noose under Blackfriars Bridge in London, his feet dangling in muddy water on the Thames. He was wearing a lightweight gray suit. An expensive Patek Philippe watch remained on his wrist, and $20,000 was stuffed in his wallet. And in his pockets were 4 pairs of eyeglasses, and his doctored Italian passport, and 5 bricks had been stuffed in his trousers.
So this was thought a suicide at the time, but the British investigated 20 years later, and they ruled that it was in fact a murder. The bricks are put in his pants to add weight to the body. Now, this was done so that when he was hung, his neck would look like it had been broken, okay, from being hung. And so you have an expert at hanging people. Okay, now, who has that kind of expertise? Since hanging wasn't used in Europe. That's a very interesting fact. But the British investigation 20 years later finds out that, well, about 10, 15 years later, finds out that he was probably strangled to death on board a boat on the Thames. And they brought his body there and hung it to make it look like he committed suicide. He didn't commit suicide. And it was done on Blackfriars Bridge, and to create all these illusions like mystery behind it, the mafia did it, or the Freemasons did it. And because Calvi was a member of the P2 Lodge, which is CIA front in Italy for created so that if they needed to overthrow the government in Italy, they were ready to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so Calvi was not clean. He wasn't an honest man at all. Um, hmm. This raises lots of questions for me.
Yeah.
John Paul II gets murdered because he says he's going to clean up the Vatican Bank. Then John Paul II gets in power and he appoints one of the most corrupt people in the previous administration, Marcinkus, to be president of Vatican City State and Vatican Bank, which he must know is corrupt. And then he's shot at after the Bank Ambrosiano goes belly up on the stock market, and then Calvi is nabbed, and Calvi has to be gotten rid of. It really makes it look like John Paul II, who's the only one who knew Calvi was squealing, him and Marcinkus, is involved in the murder. Is the one saying, this guy has to disappear. He knows what we're up to, and this has to be kept tight.
Mm-hmm.
And but my from a greater point of view is if John Paul II had collaborated with the CIA in Poland and he becomes Pope, what would the CIA want? They would want him to collaborate more, and maybe he was being resistant to that. So you have him shot from someone in Bulgaria who's probably associated with the CIA heroin traffic from out of Afghanistan that's washed through Bulgaria. And you make John Paul II feel like he's been shot by the communists. Now he has to do something about the communists. And matter of fact, after this, John Paul II agrees through those Panamanian companies to start washing CIA money to Poland in briefcases sent by clergy out of the Vatican to topple the Polish government and bring down communism. So it could have, all this could be just to manipulate John Paul II into serving the Masonic interests for Poland, because the government in Poland was communist. And that just didn't serve the lodge purposes, because what was the problem with the government, the communist government in Poland? Its persecution of the church was making the Poles more Catholic and more faithful. They needed a Masonic government that would rip down their morality, subvert them. And matter of fact, when the new government comes in Poland, Solidarity takes power and they run their first actual free election. John Paul II says, you don't have to vote Catholic. You can even vote pro-abortion. It's up to you. It's your decision.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't sound like a Catholic Pope. That sounds like a Freemason.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very sordid affair. And a lot of people that investigated and accused of it, they all got acquitted. One Italian mafioso spoke up about this. And let's maybe end with his quote, because he really tells you what's going on. What was his name?
It was Francisco Frank the Strangler de Carlo, the heroin traffic manager for the Sicilian Mafia, testified that he had been approached to kill Calvi by members of the Corleones crime family under Capo Giuseppe Pippo Calvo, the mob cashiers. Interviewed in 2012, the notorious super crass informer said, I was in Rome and received a phone call from a friend in Sicily telling me that a certain high-ranking mafia member had just been killed. I will never forget the date because of this. It was 16 June 1982, 2 days before Calvi was murdered. The friend told me that Pippo Calvo was trying to get hold of me because he needed me to do something for him. In the hierarchy of the Cosa Nostra, he was the general, I was a colonel, so he was a little higher up than my superior. While I finally spoke to Pippo, he told me not to worry, that the problem had been taken care of. That's the code we use in the Cosa Nostra. We never talk about killing someone. We say they have been taken care of. Calvi was naming names. No one had any trust in him anymore. He owed a lot of money. His friends had all distanced themselves. Everyone wanted to get rid of him. He had been arrested and he had started to talk. Then he tried to kill himself by cutting his wrist. He was released but knew he could be rearrested at any time. He was weak. He was a broken man. I was not the one who hanged Calvi. One day I may write the full story. But the real killers will never be brought to justice because they are being protected by the Italian state and members of the P2 Masonic Lodge. They have massive power. They are made up of a mixture of politicians, bank presidents, military, top security, and so on. This is the case that they continue to open and close again and again, but it will never be resolved. The higher you go, the less evidence you will find.
It's significant that this final investigation in Italy would begin. This testimony was given in 2012. Pope Benedict opened up the Vatican archives, and all the information came out in 2012. We saw that in London. They published all the information showing how Donovan bought off the Vatican after the war. So by 2012, Pope Benedict XVI certainly now knows that the Vatican is completely controlled by the mafia and the CIA, and that it's not what it appears to be. And 7 months later, he decides to fake a renunciation. And I think that's his response to it. And maybe we'll do a program on that. And this has been an excellent program, AJ. And I only ask you as a Catholic, you're listening, don't lose faith, but ask yourself, why hasn't your bishop or your pastor talked to you about this? And why hasn't he demanded the Vatican get cleaned up? And it has a lot to do with the pedophilia scandal and all the corruption around the world in the Catholic clergy. This is not the church. These are evil men who have betrayed Christ in their duties, okay? And the church can have problems of corruption like any town, but we need to clean up the corruption. And anyone in the clergy or religious who's not calling for this to be cleaned up is part of the problem. Thank you, AJ, for having me on Ordo Militaris Radio TV.
Yeah. This is Ordo Militaris Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.